caught for dodgy money.
Opioid addiction and lead poisoning, and then it turns out that the court have found him to be psychotic, mentally ill, and so he can plead diminished responsibility, despite lying.
Yeah, we're all fucking liars.
Broad daylight as he was walking his dog.
Oh yeah, now they say he meant well.
Because he got involved in an altercation between Daffy and his landlord and the landlord's teenage son. And Wayne Broadhurst was the only British man. And now Daffy is allowed to plead manslaughter because he comes from a country that has world historic rates of cousin marriage, opioid addiction, and lead poisoning. And then it turns out that the court have found him to be psychotic, mentally ill, and so he can plead diminished responsibility, despite lying about why he was in the country in the first place, despite lying about his age, saying he's 5 years older than he actually was, despite saying that his dad was killed by the Taliban when that wasn't true. That's all a stain on Jenrick's record, and therefore it's a stain on reform until those issues are resolved, if they can be. And I think reform, as we'll get onto much later, are listening to substantive criticisms. And so I'm going to offer some, in case they'll take it up.
People.
But all of our criticisms are beside the point. Because just as very few people were following the story about Farrage's finances, 70 people, according to YouGov, hadn't even heard of it or weren't following it closely. So it was a very Westminster-focused, online politics-focused issue. Lots of people still see Farage as their only hope against the establishment. Their only ability to secure the mass deportations of illegals, to put a pause, at the very least, on legal migration, to ensure net negative migration, which is now the position of both Robert Jenrick and Zia Youssef, and they haven't been kicked out of the party yet saying it, so we can only assume it's now official Reform Party policy. And they don't really get into the personality conflicts, the struggle for succession that is still going on in Reform. People don't get into that. When you're dealing with politics at the level of
because he needs to go
your average member of the
quite
public,
a lot of things. Immigration is a lot.
And
might well
be a Farage supporter that might still listen to BBC
this with Ukraine.
We don't involvement in politics
anymore.
This doesn't affect it.
We cannot
Instead, all they'll
afford
see is Farage, thus Count Binface. And Count Binface being bankrolled by Labour megadonor Dale Vince, who is a massive ally of the Middleland.
Oh, you say you can't hear that?
Well, he's getting very rich from renewable subsidies contracts. Our electricity costs are the highest in the developed world.
There's not enough firemen, there's not
Rachel
enough
Reeves,
equipment,
the City Chancellor, who has impoverished the country, and rather than take fair criticism, but the fact that she has grown the £22 billion black hole into a £134 billion deficit, she complains about mansplaining instead. She posts online, "I will accept Nigel Farage's request to be appointed steward and bailiff of the Manor of Northstead, his resignation to trigger the Clacton by-election. It is a farce and a desperate distraction, and the people of Clacton deserve better, but if he wants to spend the summer arguing with a bin, I won't stop him." So you seem gleeful about the fact that the voters in Clacton aren't being offered a real alternative if you're saying that Farage is a charlatan. So the establishment are putting up, by default, Farage, who they say is a grifter, who is dangerous, who is a charlatan, and Count Binface. The same Count Binface that MPs are currently trying to change rules to allow to wear his costume in the Commons. The same Count Binface that Liberal Democrat MPs are sitting on the green benches saying, "Hey, you giant fucking clown, you can sit right next to us when you come in." I mean, he would be right at home among the Lib Dems. The same Count Binface who the presumptive Prime Minister is making jokes about shaking hands with at the Makerfield count on the timeline, meaning the sitting Labour government is endorsing Count Binface. Now,
he's already doing fucking.
Just to say, I'm just going to quote Rachel Maddow here. No, you've not even gone to hell. This is not a very, very bad dream. This is us. This is our country. This is our life now. Nevertheless, Farage has actually pulled this off.
That's why we need.
It's because the establishment owns Binface. And even Binface was incredulous about this. Why is this sentence coming from my mouth? When he appeared on BBC Newsnight, essentially saying, I don't know why anyone pays the licence fee, because Newsnight, a very serious political programme, has basically become a glorified podcast that nobody really watches. And there was an Andrew Marr interview on LBC where they said, well, who funds you? And he just was allowed to give these farcical, painfully unfunny answers. Honestly, I've had more humorous stubbed toes. The entire election is a joke. Only because they are interviewing him as if his joke policies have
country,
equal weight
England,
to not just reforms policy,
Anti-Birmingham coming and
but
declare the
to
country
apparently the
is in a
circumvention of
national
parliamentary
and
procedure they're
emergency.
accusing Farage of. If
Well,
this truly were a really serious breach of
that's what
parliamentary
Rupert
procedure,
needs to start saying. The
with his
country's in a
donations,
national
if
emergency.
Farage really was trying to get out of legitimate investigation,
We need to fight on
then
that.
shouldn't
Well,
you
we
be
are
able to
fighting
run
on
against
it
a
on a
credible
national
candidate,
emergency.
campaign on
That's
that and
what we're
win?
saying.
It's strange that you're not going to do that. That's it.
Yeah.
You're allowing this farce to play out, so you own the farce. And I think the reason they're doing this as well is because they've not got actually any chance of beating Farage and Clacton. Clacton, if you remember, was the only place to elect the UK MP, Douglas Carswell, when he resigned the Conservative whip, crossed over to UKIP, triggered a by-election, got re-elected. It was also the constituency that polled most in favour of reform at the 2024 general election. It's why Farage ran there in the first place. Clacton is a consistently very right-wing area, very patriotic. Wonderful common sense people at Clacton. And it's because it's the area where lots of companies got ethnically cleansed from East London
everything
via the diversity that's moved in following the Second World War.
The country is in a national and emergency.
My family as well.
Literally for
my family believes East London. My granddad
the country's
grew up
in a
in
national.
Poplar.
It's like a war, yeah.
In Poplar and
War in the
Lighthouse.
apocalypse.
He was
We're in a
delivered by
national
the
and
nuns that have been
emergency.
serialised in
As a
Called
war.
Midwife. His house and all of the bomb sites he used to play along in the 40s and 50s is where the Olympic Stadium now is. And lots of East Londoners moved out to Bexley, Eltham, that sort of area, when they built a series of new homes and estates in the 70s, 80s. And now they've settled around here. Much like many Cockneys went to Essex and seaside towns like Clacton or places like Basildon, Billericay. And so I do know these people as well. You probably wouldn't detect it because I have a bit of received pronunciation because I did a lot of silent reading as a kid. I blame all the JRPGs that I played and had to sort of read it, overemphasize in my mind. But I went on a lot of caravan holiday parks holidays as a child because we didn't have a lot of money.
Yeah,
and so I went to places like Great Yarmouth, which is Rupert's constituency. I went to Combe Haven in Hastings quite frequently. I spent a lot of time on the Isle of Wight as well. In the holiday park, it's not the nice posh B&Bs. The people that are there are not expressly political. Like, they don't pay attention to terminally Westminster bubble stories like the amount of donations that Nigel Farage is receiving. What they do pay attention to is the feeling of dispossession of their country by large waves of immigration, the feeling of regional poverty in these left-behind seaside towns, and they also channel their political sentiments into these avatar figures like Farage, or, if we want to use an allegory, of Donald Trump. Right? There were lots of left-behind Americans in flyover country that thought that Trump was their man, and that's why he won his seismic mandate in 2024. Whether or not he's used that prudently is up for debate. Nevertheless, it is inarguable that Donald Trump was an avatar of white Americans who have been left behind concerns. And the same is happening in areas of the North, which are flirting with Burnham at the moment, but I'm pretty sure the love affair will lose its sheen pretty quickly when he makes contact with government, and all over Essex and in left behind seaside towns. And so when you insult them by saying, we don't even consider you to be worthy of a legitimate election, here's a bin to vote for instead, you're treating them with scorn and derision, and they're already a core constituency for Farage because he won a seismic majority at the last election when Reform weren't topping national polls. He won something like over 8,000 votes, more than his closest opponent. And so this time around, Farage is going to win. And I think they know. And I would be really glad to see this kind of politics killed off. The New Statesman wrote a piece saying, we are all Count Binface. But the most annoying one I saw was actually published this morning from Sophie Jenkinson in The Guardian. Because The Guardian almost exists to piss me off personally. I believe this. I am the main character of reality. Farage had it for a day there, but then he's been deranged. Count Binface represents the silly sausage Britain I know and love. Our country is facing demographic, fiscal, cultural obsolescence. We have horrors in the headlines every single day. And you think it's a great idea to summarise our national culture as a place that doesn't take itself too seriously, that's underpinned by self-deprecation, that highlights our kindness towards one another and our fairness. It's the Britain of comedians like Victoria Wood and Bob Mortimer, Ramesh Ranganathan, Daisy May Cooper, It's the adverts for Yorkshire Tea, Tango, and Iron Brew. It's the Liz Truss lettuce. Honestly, that joke is more stale than the lettuce at this point. It's basically the Britain of led by donkeys. Safe, state-endorsed satire. Like Count fucking Binface. What they want is for Mr. Blobby to stand alongside Nigel Farage at the camp, and then when they gerrymander the electoral process, and then after an opposition party has been through the ringer of MI5 infiltration and subversion, lawfare, changing the rules so that foreign donations can't go into the party, despite multiple donor scandals in the sitting party, multiple corruption scandals even. Louise Haig has been behind the orchestration of Andy Burnham becoming Prime Minister, and she was kicked out of Starmer's cabinet as Transport Secretary because of fraud. The same with Angela Rayner. She failed to pay her council tax on time for her second home. She didn't declare it properly or whatever. And she's now on LBC as a guest host talking about Farage's donations, as if she has any legitimacy. Keir Starmer himself had all those undeclared donations from Lord Alley. Pretty weird relationship going on there, but nevertheless, I won't comment. But don't worry, we've got Mr. Blobby standing next to you.
And don't
so
worry,
we can
we've
all
got
point
King
out
Charles
that
doing
you've
it as
got
well.
an attempt to actually fix the country.
Dodgy donations
while
in the
untold horrors
suitcase
are
of money from
inflicted on us
Saudi
anyway.
Arabia.
You know what? I don't think it's very funny. And I don't
got
think many
more
people
doing
find it
it.
funny either.
I don't
think
find
that
it still
things
funny,
are
mate,
so
and Nigel
serious,
Farage
events
doing
have
it
progressed to
either,
such an
though.
extent that we just can't afford this absurdity anymore. And people will reject it. And
No,
that's
it's
a
not
good thing.
funny of him
And I
doing it.
think,
And
inadvertently,
Reformer doing it.
Farage will
Look,
come out of this
the
stronger.
fucking
And
them.
these are
Robert
equivalent to
Jenrick and all
Trump's
them.
2022-2023 years,
and
where he
Richard
was
Dice
facing the
and
FBI raiding Melania's underwear.
Nigel
Or
Farage
he was facing
doing that
frivolous
now
lawsuits
as
from
well,
Eugene
mate.
Carroll and all of these charges from like Fannie Willis and whoever else, Alden Bragg, and eventually
I
Edward Marshall taken.
understand what
And
you're
it
saying
leads
about
right up
mainstream
until
people,
the
Keir
assassination.
Starmer and them, how they've got
When
a right to
it
speak.
becomes kinetic.
You're quite,
When it
he's
becomes very
quite
real.
right, but what
And
I'm
when
going to say
suddenly
is neither of Nigel
people
Farage,
realise
because
that
two
the
wrongs don't
lawfare
make a
waged
right.
against him, the stochastic terrorism,
So that
to
means
borrow a
he's
term,
got to go and
of the
do that, the
mainstream media
same as what
constantly
they're
calling him
doing.
Hitler and a threat to democracy and the pay of
Yeah.
Vladimir Putin, has painted a target on his back and has got my father, Corey Compatore, killed. And I think we're getting to that point. And anyone willing to play along with that frivolity will be to blame for it as well when things get serious. This is why Ron DeSantis made a grave mistake for his entire political career when he ran against Trump in 2023, and when asked on the campaign trail, what do you think of the Stormy Daniels case? He said, well, I don't know anything about paying hush money to a porn star, as if he was making light of or treating legitimate the dragging through the courts of Donald Trump just to try to prevent him from being president again. And all that did was marshal support for Trump against DeSantis, because DeSantis looked like he was being disloyal to Trump, who was the scion of the party at that point and remains it. And because DeSantis didn't have the political nous to see the inevitability of Trump's return, not just in the election, but also to the White House. And so that's why it would have been very imprudent for Restore Britain to have stood in the Clacton by-election.
Yeah.
And it would be imprudent for them to stand again, because you look like you're playing
But
the
we
part of
can't,
Ron
because he's doing
DeSantis.
Manchester.
A ankle biter that is gleefully playing along with an establishment stitch-up because you stand to gain personally at
And
the
the-
expense of not just
like
Nigel
saying-
Farage, but the hopes of the country that people are pinning on Farage. You look like you're participating in a show trial at the very same
No.
time the country is facing destruction. You look like you are not serious. And I think we've already had a
No, we
harsh
are
reminder of
serious.
that, because while everyone was cackling about Count Binface, Anne Willigan got murdered. And Nigel Farage went down and laid a wreath at the site where he could remember his friend. And then there was a
Oh,
deluge
gotcha.
of articles from The Times, tweets from opposition journalists, people going as far as to accuse him of a conspiracy of having her killed to distract from his donations scandal. He's mourning a friend that got killed because, it seems, of her affiliation with Reform and because of her long-standing advocacy for patriotic, socially conservative Catholic politics. Because at first we were told, oh, don't speculate,
No,
it's
but
got
it's
nothing
like
to
a
do with
robot,
politics.
though.
And it could well have
He's
been
like
some
a
random
robot.
ruggie
He's
who
got
broke
no-
in, didn't realise who
he's a
she
bit like a
was,
robot,
robbing a
like
pension,
Sam, who
and
doesn't
killed her in a struggle. And it would have been no less tragic and appalling if that were the case. But now it's
Nigel Farage doesn't have a personality, mate.
The political maelstrom swirling around Farage has become that bit more deadly. Now, even Shabana Mahmood has had to concede that they may need to revisit the proposals about his taxpayer-funded security, which was significantly diminished the day after Charlie Kirk was murdered.
You have to be just like that.
Now, his claim that he needs private, friendly donors like George Cottrell and Christopher Harborne to pay for his lifelong security, at least until he wins the next general election, then has lifelong taxpayer-funded security as a Prime Minister and ex-Prime Minister. Seems a lot more credible now, doesn't it?
Well, so does Rupert Lowe.
Nevertheless, you've got people like Dan Hodges at the Mail. Dan Hodges, who was Gawain Towler of UKIP's, now on the Reform Board, though it seems completely out of lockstep with the party. Dan Hodges, who was Gawain Towler's contact ahead of the 2015 election, so that UKIP could vet their candidates via Hope Not Hate. So Dan Hodges, Hope Not Hate operative, is now amplifying a Times article. The Times, again, who published photos of Nigel Farage's daughter's house, who have tasked a journalist who previously tweeted about how he hated Farage, the Times who endorsed Labour at the last election, who publish Tory apparatchiks like Fraser Nelson, who just willfully lie about the costs and crimes of migration they've supported. He quote retweeted a Times newspaper that said Nigel Farage has been accused of using Anne Widdecombe's death as propaganda, and that an unnamed family source with the Mail told the paper Widdecombe's family didn't want her death hijacked for political purposes and were very uneasy about Farage attending the scene of the investigation. It was also conspicuous the BBC reported that specially trained officers were working with Widdecombe's family. So, probably Raiku intervening to sort of coerce them to give a don't look back in anger statement again. But Anne Widdecombe's murder, even that, is not beyond the pale for Farage's opponents to use against him. And so all this is going to do is endear sympathy for the man. And again, this is coming from me, who has been consistently critical of Farage when he's put a foot wrong. Now, I've been praiseworthy, where it's warranted, his statement after Henry Novak's murder. Excellent. His Substack post on how Britain is an anti-white state, which we'll be mentioning in a forthcoming video. Very well done. And so all that this will produce is that people who have criticised him in the past, recognising reality, which is that this is a stitch-up, this is ill-motivated at every level, and wanting him to win it. Because obviously, it would be a bad thing if Nigel Farage lost the Clacton by-election, which he won't, but it would be bad, because then it would reward all of these awful underhanded tactics by Parliament, by the media, by state-approved satirists, to mock and deride people who dare to talk about the very real problems that our country faces and dares to fix them as well. And it's not like they don't have a legitimate reason to want more security. It's not like Reform don't have a legitimate reason to be worried. Because I see the Mail reporting that Zia Yusuf is being unduly paranoid. Apparently, there are people in Reform that are like briefing to enemy press, like The Observer, or even potentially the Mail here, that they want Farage to take a proper holiday, and then some of them have told the Times and The Observer they want him to sack Zia Yusuf because they're worried that he's too paranoid and too polarising. They say they want Farage to crack down on rampant paranoia and infighting within Reform as the party's poll lead shrinks, as we started with. According to a source, Zia Yusuf is so fearful about being bugged that he started holding important meetings in the back of his car as it's been driven around. Yeah, I don't blame him for wanting to take his security seriously. Not just because, as Richard Tice has pointed out, the National Crime Agency may have leaked details about his finances and Nigel Farage's finances to The Guardian back in April. So apparently, George Cottrell's mum sent £500,000 to Richard Tice, and then another £500,000 to his think tank, Britain Means Business. And only one of these was declared. And also the details about the Harborne donation, which was flagged as a suspicious transaction by the National Crime Agency, may have also been handed off to The Guardian by leakers in the National Crime Agency, which would of course be illegal, because those are meant to be confidential, they're meant to be a government department. And Tice is now, as he told the Telegraph, raising a query with the National Crime Agency as to whether or not Reform has been the victim of malicious leaking by activists within the state to newspapers that would like to see Farage halted in his tracks. So I don't blame Zia Yusuf at all for taking extra precautions. I don't blame him for wanting to be on the move so that he can't be attacked if he's caught unawares by security. Like, it must be really difficult to just go and have dinner somewhere, for example. So, I won't disclose too much. But in the course of my friendship with the former Prime Minister Liz Truss, unexpected friendship, whenever we've just gone for a catch-up, it's had to be screened ahead of time. There's had to be extensive security scoping out the place. They've got to wait around there. And she faces fewer threats than Farage does, I'm sure. But there's still precautions that you have to go through.
Well,
and those are
sort
of like state protocols, because she's an ex-Prime Minister. If you're having to do all this privately, there's even more additional logistics that you have to consider.
Really her,
because then you might not want private security on their premises, unlike what they might have to accept from Scotland Yard or the state, for example. So there's all sorts of additional difficulties that must just make their lives cumbersome. And so, I'm sympathetic. But instead, there are people within Reform now seizing upon this. As Jacob Rees-Mogg alleged, it could be that the leaks about George Cottrell's donations came from within Reform itself. When asked whether the stories about Cottrell had come from inside the tent within Reform as part of leadership manoeuvring around Farage, he said that wouldn't be surprising as politics. So both Farage and Zia Youssef, now in Question Time, are making the contours known to the public about people within Reform trying to bring Reform down from the inside. Like, the call is coming from inside the house. Farage and Zia are now making the call. Reform source said, there's definitely a chatty rat in Reform. And that's the nickname given to the leaker of COVID-19 lockdown plans in 2020. Cottrell has the power to tell Nigel to block people from good jobs or being a by-election candidate, so there's every incentive to bring him down. And, again, without disclosing too much, I do know that Farage takes George's advice seriously, because he's described him as being like a son. And there was a set-to over whether or not someone should be hired in, I think it was 2024 or early 2025. And George Cottrell and another high-profile member of Reform's leadership team, who I think now would regret the decision they made, disagree. And Cottrell's advice was overruled. But he certainly does
someone like
weigh
Rupert
in
Lowe wasn't trying to take Reform
on
down.
matters of prudence and judgment.
Rupert Lowe wasn't trying to take Reform down. He's one of the people that wasn't trying to take Reform down. He was one of the people that was standing right by Reform.
George's reach is so extensive, it could bring Nigel down with him. And where's the party then?
We got the bit of giving the grooming gang scandal.
We've been documenting in previous videos the internal power struggle.
And part of that will be part of deportation and the finding
orchestrated those Tory defections.
What he's been doing, inquiries and everything else.
As the heir apparent.
That.
And it says in here, when former Tory immigration minister Ronald Jeremy defected to Reform in January, it was said to come as a blow to Richard Tice and Youssef, who was understood to have regarded himself as the anointed successor. A source said, this is it. He thought, I'll be leader after Nigel. There was always tension with Richard after that. Then Jeremy came in, and both were knocked off course. But it was less of a blow to Richard than to Zia. There's someone very, very close leaking. A lot of the stuff about George I personally have no clue about.
So it's someone to do with them. It's someone to do with one of them in the party.
It's the heir apparent. And it says in here, when former Tory immigration minister Ronald Jeremy defected to Reform in January, it was said to have come as a blow.
I think with Rupert Lowe, I think Youssef and Nigel Farage and that made a massive mistake. Massive thing with Rupert Lowe. Massively, completely wrong. They went too far. No, they went far too far with what they did with Rupert Lowe. That was well uncalled for with what they did with Rupert Lowe. Youssef and Nigel Farage. And they're still doing it. Ain't Rupert Lowe doing things to them, it's the other way round. It's been Reform Party doing it to Rupert Lowe. And I'm sorry, but if they think like that, how should they think Rupert Lowe feels? when they've been calling him an Nazi, and he's dealing with the grooming gang and dealing with getting people deported. How does Nigel Farage think Rupert Lowe must feel? And he's been on that show, and then he's got people saying that he's a conspiracy theory and all this. How does Nigel Farage think that feels? And then when Nigel Farage is her and the rest of them and whatever, calling the fucking Nazis, calling the Restore Party people Nazis and Charlie Downs and that. How do they think them people must feel? Exactly. And they had a chance, Reform Party, Nigel Farage and Yusuf and that, they had a chance to try and sort it out with Rupert Lowe. They had a chance to drop it and drop it with the police and everything else. Yes, they did. They had a chance to deal with it and drop it. They didn't have to take it so far when it wasn't true. Because what? Because they took that money that they shouldn't have done. For what? Don't care. Buy houses and things like that.
To Richard Tice and Yusuf, who was understood to have regarded himself as the anointed successor. A source said, "This is it. He thought, I'll be leader after Nigel." There was always tension with Richard after that. Then Jeremy came in, and both were knocked off course.
There you go. So Yusuf wanted to basically come and he's paid his way to the party. Yusuf, yeah, Muslim, has paid his way into the party and thought he could be the Prime Minister when he gets rid of Nigel Farage. Yep.
I think that's understandable. Someone said, it's an internal power struggle. The trouble is that George's reach is so extensive, it could bring Nigel down with him. And where's the party then? And it's almost like that's the goal. We've been documenting in previous videos the internal power struggle in Reform between some Tory defectors, between people that have orchestrated those Tory defections, and someone like Zia Yusuf, who has seen himself as the heir apparent. And it says in here, when former Tory Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick defected to Reform in January, it was said to have come as a blow to Richard Tice and Yusuf, who was understood to have regarded himself as the anointed successor. A source said, "This is it. He thought, I'll be leader after Nigel." There was always tension with Richard after that. Then Jeremy came in, and both were knocked off course. But it was less of a blow to Richard than to Zia. There's someone very, very close leaking. A lot of the stuff about George I personally have no clue about. Extraordinary. I guess there's multiple sources. But there's clearly one source that's very close in. And it seems like the person talking to the Mail, acting as a senior source about the infighting, is trying to blame Zia for the leaking about George Cottrell. But Farage isn't blaming Zia. People around Farage aren't blaming Zia. If anything, Zia and lots of people that are trying to encourage Farage to change tactics are closing ranks. So this seems like even more manoeuvring by someone with a vested interest, not to just get rid of Farage, but Cottrell, but Zia too, to open up a pathway to take over Reform, perhaps to complete its conversion into a recycled Tory party, performing political necromancy on the Conservatives. The source added, Zia's gone a bit mental. If he wants to see you, he'll summon you down and drive around Westminster in the back of a van. That is why you see him doing his television appearances from there, rampant paranoia. Yusuf didn't respond to the request for comment, and Cottrell said he thought it was total bullshit that he was being briefed against from within the party. So again, the people that are closest to Farage are saying that they don't think it's Zia, they don't think it's James Orr, they don't think it's some of Farage's most loyal and top team. They think it's coming from the Tory defectors. We already saw previously how the likes of Tim Montgomery are just blatantly on the timeline calling for Zia to be post. because he thinks that he's too hostile to the Tories.
And
He's too
I've never
off-putting
done anything
to
like
potential
that to the
converts
Reform
that
Party.
have
No, he
just realised
he's
that
not done
the 14 years of
anything
governance that
to
they supported has been a
or
ruin for
anyone
the
in the
country.
Reform
And to see his
Party.
credit, he understands that. And Reform are actually starting to get it on multiple fronts. Because the fact that Farage hasn't
He
thrown
was
zero at the
doing
bus,
what he was meant
the
to
fact
be
that
doing.
Farage has shown some
Rupert Lowe was the only
resilience
one in
against
that
these
party at the
underhand
time.
leaking
Well, I'm not saying
tactics,
they're all not doing
and
what
that
they're
the
meant to do,
team
but
has sort of
Rupert
sniffed
Lowe
out
was
what's
doing
going
his
on,
job, what
has
he was
shown that
meant
again
to
they're willing
be
to listen to criticism.
with Reform
And
Party.
I'm glad that some of my criticisms have been well received in recent weeks. And
By
you can see
winning
that
the
in here in this
by-election
long
in,
piece in The Spectator by Tim Shipman, evaluating the prudence of Farage's gamble,
Southampton.
calling the by-election, and now being forced to stand against
Where
Benford.
is it? Great
So,
Yarmouth.
Reform have responded to every party withdrawing from the by-election. They say
And
they're
everything
cowards
else.
because they know that Farage will win. But it opens with the following anecdote. And I spoke to a source in Reform who said the meeting didn't go as is described here. But I will say that
be doing
the
anything
theme of
like
trying to listen to their critics and realising what's gone wrong after they've underperformed
maybe
in
that's what's
by-elections,
gone
after
wrong, the
they've
money.
subsided in the polls, after they've sustained a
Reform
series
Party.
of unanticipated attacks, the theme that Reform are listening to critics is true. So, the piece opens with, when Reform High Command gathered in the boardroom of their Millbank headquarters last Tuesday, the meeting was supposed to select candidates in their 120 most winnable seats and choose dozens of campaign managers. If you want a bit of feedback, ditch Lady Cunningham. She's a total liability, she gives terrible interviews, and people in the outer boroughs of London don't like her, and that's why you're currently in third behind the
Get rid
Tories
of all the ones
in the London
stupid
mayoral
people they've brought
Anyway,
in and bring
The meeting
Rupert
went on
Lowe
for
and
6
Ben
hours.
Libby
As party
back.
chiefs instead addressed a growing sense of unease that the great momentum of 2025 had been lost. A source familiar with the discussions reveals that Chris Breen-Lowe, pollster and message man,
And Rupert
also
Lowe.
a long stalwart employee of UKIP and the Brexit Party, who was alleged to be telling the party previously not to focus on immigration in 2024, which is one of the reasons why they might have backed off, and it's because the polling wasn't as good as the polling of the likes of Banksy
I also
and
did say
Aaron Banks, and Andy Wigmore were conducting during the Brexit referendum, so that was a misstep. Anyway, Chris Breen-Lowe apparently had been concerned for months that Reform needs to do something big to take back control. Chris challenged people, saying things aren't working the way they need to, said the source. James Orr, Robert Jenrick and Zia Yusuf were all asked for their best ideas, but nothing much was forthcoming. It was at this point the source says that Farage said words to the effect of, it's time to put my own testicles on the line. A Reform source says, since about February, there had been a growing feeling that Reform was becoming a party which was no longer in command of its own destiny as we would wish to be. February is, of course, when Restore Britain launched. Restore is growing. Every innovation we made in political technology was nicked and adopted by the other parties. And that's true. When Farage tries to ride the wave rather than build it himself, he finds himself behind the curve, outpaced by events. And so, I think this was why Farage called the by-election. They felt the need to summon some courage they didn't realise that they would need to deploy ahead of when they thought they would need to deploy it. And so this is why you're seeing a rush to catch up with rhetoric, to regain lost credibility. And even if the meeting didn't pan out exactly as was described by this source, who himself may have ulterior motives for leaking to The Spectator, for looking like the only credible voice in the room, while Reform's top leadership, particularly James Orr and Zia, who are quite closely aligned, apparently seem bumbling and clueless and don't know what's going on. Even though there might be some ill motive to this leak, it is generally true that Reform are doing some soul searching. This is something that even Isabel Oakeshott admitted on air with Reform proxy and talk host Jeremy Kyle. Isabel Oakeshott being the fiancée of Richard Tice, she said that Reform are trying to understand why they've consistently underperformed despite being at the top of every opinion poll. And core to their diagnosis is the understanding that Restore didn't need to exist. That if you hadn't have booted Rupert Lowe out of the party and reported him to the police, no matter how difficult you may have found to work with him, if you hadn't have left lots of talent on the table, gone out of your way to estrange the online right, if you hadn't have misjudged the public mood on things like who is British, whether or not there is an ethnic component to English, Scottish, Welsh and Irish identity, whether or not people would like not just the mass deportation of illegals, but millions of legal migrants to return home too. Whether or not just that Muslims are the least likely demographic to vote for you, but that the public despise Islam. Overwhelmingly, they think it is incompatible with our civilization, with our preferences, with our prejudices, with our identity. They've misjudged all of these things, and now they're trying to recover from them.
as well, mate,
Some
on
people
the
won't
streets.
them. me included,
It's incompatible.
the US strategist, Jerry Gunster, who has hosted various parties that Farage has been guest of honor at, including the party hosted for the 250th anniversary of America and the inauguration night party, which I attended January last year, he has identified Restore Britain as a danger. But one problem within his diagnosis is one Reform source says, or at least is trying to put out into the ether, that Restore is a Tory put-up job expertly organised by Gavin Williamson. That's not true. Gavin Williamson actually denies he is the Midlands answer to Machiavelli. Not true. Again, knowing the people that were involved in setting up Restore, the young lads, and having conversations at the time, that wasn't the case. It was set up as a pressure campaign to force Reform to be less shit. Now, it was possible that Reform could, in an act of contrition, the likes of which Donald Trump performed in 2023 and 2024, bringing all of his former adversaries
to be
into
less
the fold,
shit.
like RFK,
It was
JD
set
Vance,
up, Restore Party,
it was possible
set
that the
up
Reform
to
whip
basically get rid of Labour and Conservative Party. So then we have two new parties. Because you can't have just one party. You've got to have two parties for all of elections in the future and whatever else. So there's got to be an opposition assigned to Reform, which is Restore Britain. Right? So then you've got Labour and Conservatives. The opposition new party to Reform is Restore Britain. So what is all the fucking problems about?
He offered back to Rupert Lowe in an act of contrition and reconciliation.
You get me, really? If I think about it, right, what are they all talking about?